In today's video, I wanted to walk through my process for assessing a short-term rental property and projecting the revenue to ultimately decide whether or not it's a good investment. I recently had a discussion about this with a friend and subscriber, also a fellow Minnesotan, and I realized it's kind of hard to get that certainty no matter how good you are with numbers. And sometimes it helps just looking at someone else's perspective and hearing a second opinion on whatever their process is with looking and analyzing numbers. I personally found it really useful when I was at that stage, just watching other people analyze property and knowing, oh yeah, that's actually similar to what I do, or oh wow, I didn't consider that aspect. Let me add it to my own method. So hopefully if you're in a similar situation, this video helps you. So just some brief background on the property we're analyzing. It is a 5-bed, 2-bath property in Minnesota that they recently flipped. And my friend was trying to figure out whether the best strategy would be to either sell it or do a long-term rental or a short-term rental. Now, for the first two things, he was already pretty good at with analyzing, and where I come in is really as a second set of eyes and second opinion and projecting what revenue it could make in a year. So after double checking we are okay on the regulations front, I then analyzed the market using AirDNA, who is very kindly sponsoring today's video. I've personally preferred AirDNA for the purpose of shopping for a rental and analyzing markets, analyzing property, because it's one subscription for all the markets in the US and the world, which for a lot of people makes more sense because in the beginning, you don't actually know which market you're investing in yet, and this allows you that open-endedness before you make a decision. So after you log in, this is kind of what it looks like. After clicking into the US, you can see all the different markets, and I go ahead and just search for St. Paul, Minnesota. At the top, you see a score, and personally, I don't quite rely on the score by itself because the score is kind of subjective, right? Seasonality, regulations, like what does that actually mean? That's more something you have to figure out for yourself. On the top are just broad market analytics. Further down, you can see the amenities and how many bedrooms these listings are, kind of as a general lay of the land. And one thing that really jumped out at me is the rental growth in the past couple of years with the increase in number of supply and increase in number of active listings. There are currently 1,000 listings in the area, and it has grown in the past 3 years. So kind of something to be cautious about. Within the market, there are a good chunk of properties that are not available for the whole year. Actually, some are 1 to 90 nights. It's interesting to note that in this market, there are property managers, but none of them quite have a high review average. Which I think is kind of appealing, right? Like there are not that strong of competitors in terms of very organized property management teams. Now, under the section of occupancy, I like to broaden my view for past 2 years or 3 years. And on the graph, you can see the seasonality is pretty consistent with summer months being the higher occupied months. And the stay duration is roughly 3 days with very little variation. I also like the how many bedrooms did listings have tab just to see like over time which chunk has grown or shrunk. So my impression is they've all kind of grown a little bit. It's not like just the 4 to 5 bedrooms exploded, which would be more detrimental for this specific property. And then for how does demand change over time, I like this graph too because like occupancy only tells part of the story, but to understand how many nights were booked, like that is truly more reflective of the guest demand, like more number of nights and more bookings being made. That means demand is growing. It's just that supply is also growing. But at least that's good to see that both are growing at a healthy pace. And then the last tab of when are future reservations being booked, that's kind of interesting. But honestly, at this stage, I don't think that that's big of a deal in projecting revenue yet. Within the revenue section, the top numbers I find are not enough to conclude anything. I like to break down the monthly revenue by month and by year just to see how it has varied over time for the peak months and the lower months. And I also like to look at the graph where you can see how much revenue did the listings earn by bedroom just to see the split, right? So it seems like obviously 6 bedrooms make a lot more and have really high peaks and kind of lower troughs and I guess huge variation. 5 bedrooms less so, which is what we're talking about in this property, and even less so for the 4 bedroom. And honestly, looking back towards the previous year, it's not that bad of a change for the 4 or 5 bedroom range. Maybe a little bit less this year versus last, but we'll have to take a closer look when we dissect out that subsection of the market. How much did each real estate type make in revenue is not that useful to me because it's talking about like the whole house versus a room, and that's irrelevant for this discussion. And the distribution of listing revenue kind of just shows you the spread of like the cheapest listings or the ones that make least money versus the ones that are at the top. Again, this is kind of all of the market. So we're talking like the 1 bedrooms or like the room in a house versus the 6 bedroom mansions. So that one is only useful really when you're looking at specific bedrooms. Next, moving on to the average daily rate. So over the past 3 years, I'm seeing actually pretty healthy rates for 2023 compared to the previous years. I don't see a specific decline here. And then average daily rate by bedroom splits out the same thing, but into obviously bedrooms. And it's actually kind of surprising to see 4 bedroom and below is pretty flat. It's the 5, 6 bedrooms that have kind of a peak for the summer months. If I scale it back to 2 years, it does look like the average daily rates have declined, especially if we're looking at the 4 to 6 bedroom chunk this year versus the last year. On the top, it gives a -5%, so that's consistent with what the graphs look like. Average daily rate by price tier, I don't use that much because the definition of luxury versus economy, that is kind of based on their algorithm, and sometimes I don't think that's entirely accurate. Further down, there's a section on RevPAR. Within this section, my favorite is this calendar heat map thing, and it shows you which nights are the most expensive across the calendar in this market. So obviously it looks like it's mostly weekends and then also the summer months and maybe a little bit into the fall. I'm guessing maybe for sports. All right, so now that I have a pretty solid overview of the market, just knowing the lay of the land, knowing what the market trends are in general, to project revenue, I really need to scale back and look at just similar listings. You can filter it by like whether it's a private room or shared room, but here this is an entire place. It is a house. And we're going to do 4 to 6 bedrooms, 3 to 4 bathrooms, just to exclude the giant mansions that have like a 10 bathroom situation. And the house should be able to fit like a good 8 to 10 people, but I'm going to do 6 to 10 to start with and see what I get. Once you've done the filtering, the map on the right does show a new score. All right, so within the bigger 4 to 6 bedroom market, I wanted to find out more about how does the demand change over time. And so pulling back from the past 2 years, it looks like for this year in peak of July, it's like 1,000 nights booked. And that is much better than last July. So it's good to see that demand is growing. And then as far as the distribution of listing revenue, kind of the range bottom 25% and top 90%, it is quite the spread. I'd say the property we're looking at is more mid-range in terms of location, in terms of the design and size. And I think it could do really well with some good pictures and good interior design. But from a pricing standpoint, I would put it closer to the 50th percentile, which this tells me is maybe like the 5,000-6,000 a month on average. I'm going to actually try to filter this a little bit more just to cut out that top layer of giant mansions. Let's say it's 8 to 10 people, but I'll cap the bedrooms at 5 bedrooms. So when I update that on the map on the right, it actually doesn't change the revenue a whole lot. A lot of these are still 1 night minimum stay, which is interesting. And then looking at demand now, the nights book in July this year were 900 something versus last July, it's in the around 500. So demand has honestly almost doubled, although the supply has as well. And looking at occupancy on the low end, it's in the winter months for 40% or so. And then on the high end in the middle of summer is more like 75%. It's not that bad a fluctuation, actually. In comparison to the past couple years, it does seem like the occupancy is lower this year, despite the increase in demand. And I would say that probably speaks to how much the supply has grown. And then as far as revenue in the past couple years for the 4 to 5 bedroom range, it actually has gone down for 2023. So I feel like this was a little different than the whole market. And this gives me a little bit of worry. Or just something to budget for as we do the projections. Interesting that per bedroom, for the past couple years, it seems like the 4 to 5 bedroom space has kind of merged in terms of revenue per listing. Like, it doesn't matter if you have 4 or 5, they make roughly the same amount of money, which is kind of crazy. That's the distribution of pay, nothing crazy there. And then average daily rate seems like consistently is lower in 2023 versus the previous years. That again, I think speaks to supply outpacing demand a little bit. And then what are guests willing to pay for future stays? And this is helpful just for projection reasons. The ones that are really far out, I don't think are that accurate. These are like, there might be special reasons for people to book that far in advance. But for the closer dates in the next few months, I'd say it's like in the 200 to 300 kind of range per night. Moving down to RevPAR for the past 3 years, consistent with all the other metrics, this is actually down 21% from the past year. And again, looking at the calendar map, it seems like it's holiday season, weekends, that might be spring break in March, and then most of summer looks pretty good. But there are some really quiet times in October, in April, May, January, February. So definitely a lot of seasonality to plan for. On the next tab, there is the submarkets, and that is just basically the whole market split up by zip codes. I personally don't spend a whole lot of time on this. I think it might make sense for a bigger city with more listings. But for St. Paul, for example, each zip code might just have a handful of listings. And so these can be incredibly skewed. I'm going to find you an example. P.S. I don't know why they use the pig picture for St. Paul. Like, I don't consider St. Paul to be a rural farmland with a lot of pigs. Anyway, if I click on this 55121 zip code, and you see, wow, a score of 93, and it sounds amazing, and there's a huge revenue of like 165K, it's actually based on this one active listing that has a revenue potential based on how much they made for like one section of the year. So I don't put a lot of weight on this, especially for smaller markets. Oh, by the way, for AirDNA, the revenue includes cleaning fees, which is a little different from some other pricing projection models that you may have used in the past. All right, moving away from the submarkets, you can actually look at all 60 active short-term rental listings within St. Paul that fit those above criteria of like 4 to 5 bedrooms and can house 8+ people. I basically go through this whole list and identify what are some similar listings and how much they're charging, how much they're making, what their occupancy is looking like, what are their quality of photos, what amenities they have, and try to decide which ones are comparable, or if they're not exact comparables, like what are the difference. So like if I find a 4-bedroom that is very similar vibes and similar location, I would still put what revenue they're making or projected to make, but then make a little comment that says like, this is -1 bedroom. Or I can find another 5-bedroom that is nicer in a nice neighborhood with like a swimming pool. I would add a comment that says, this should make more money than we would, and this is why. I want to highlight this last tab, which is the for sale properties within that market. It's kind of a convenient version of having Zillow within AirDNA, so you can see all of the data within one app. This doesn't quite fit into the scenario we're talking about today, but I think for future market analysis and shopping, this could be a pretty useful tool. All right, so let's go through a few examples of these houses that I will be looking at for comps. This is a 4-bed, 2-bath that can host 9 people and decent reviews, not quite making guest favorites with a 4.8. I feel for everyone, man. It's so hard. The projected revenue is 43K and the annual revenue actual is 38K. And I think looking at these pictures, it is kind of mid-range, I'd say, like comfortable, clean, not anything crazy or fancy. It looks like a pretty standard suburban house that can house a bunch of people and could be good for like a family gathering of some sort. The occupancy rate of 68% is pretty solid. And how has this listing performed historically in terms of occupancy? It looks like it ranges from upper 20s to maybe 80, 90. They also have their upcoming calendar listed that you can scroll through and see how booked they are for future. Now this one, it's a 4-bed, 3-bath. It's kind of cute, actually. It's kind of cute, but a little different than the house we're looking at. All right, now looking at this hidden mini mansion, what are these photos? All right. If they had better photos, I think they could do better. However, just looking through the crazy photography, I would say this is maybe low to mid-range. And regardless, they are making pretty solid revenue, 54K, and with 69% occupancy, an average daily rate of just over 200. And it is a 6.2, so it's a little bit bigger than the house we're looking at, but I think still applicable. All right, let's do one more. This Como house place has pretty standard pictures. It feels like a regular suburban house, a 5-bed, 2.5 bath, and they've done 58K revenue. And they've had some pretty good months with 100% occupancy sometimes. On a good month this year, they were making like $9,000. And then on the worst months, it's like 3 digits. That's a wild swing. I guess it's only available 322 days, so maybe it wasn't available. I don't know. So I think this is actually pretty comparable, except it has an extra half bath, which I think is pretty useful when you have a big group. Let's look at this Midway Manor place. Annual revenue of 32K. It's only available about half the year, but they have really good occupancy of 87%. The photos, I think, it's an older house. I think some people like the character, so I think that is a selling point. It is also a decent location, I think. It is only a 4.2 instead of a 5.2 like we have. And looking back 2 years, it doesn't seem like they're that old of a listing, so they don't have a lot of historical data. But overall, they've done pretty well for when they do host. For revenue, it's 5K last year in June, 5K this year in June. So that hasn't been that different for them. And the calendar looks healthy for the month. They do only have a 4.6 for reviews, though, so that's potentially something you can do better at. All right, next let's look at this chic home. It's another one of those like older properties with a little bit of a remodeling done. I think that's kind of comparable. It is a pretty central location, as they mention, so I think that is a plus. It also houses 16 people. 16 people, 2 bathrooms, I feel like that's really hard to do. But they have good reviews, so people like it. 54K of total revenue, 70% occupancy. Looking over the past 12 months, solid revenue there, solid calendar in the month. And now this Higgy house thing. The photos actually are kind of budget to mid-range maybe. 16 people, 4-bed, 2 baths. They made 45K. And the occupancy is 66%. And the average daily rate is actually only 190. I suppose it is less nice. It's more of an economy place. And then this sunny urban farmhouse, they have a higher revenue of 67,000. And the pictures are definitely more, I don't know if I would call this farmhouse. I hate the misuse of farmhouse. Sorry, this is a pet peeve, irrelevant to this discussion. All right, 2-year revenue patterns that's actually really stable, other than that one dip. And a very healthy calendar. Now looking at this flat with 10 beds. A flat, okay, that's an apartment. I think that's not that comparable. So I'm going to skip that. This is the Higgy home. All these similar names. It's smaller. It's a 4.2. See, that's what I mean. It says the price tier is upscale. But looking at this, it's not upscale. You know what I mean? So I just ignored the label. I think this is the one that we said was overpriced because they're charging $400 per night for this. Definitely not competitive in this market. And then this house, I feel is, I don't know, it reads budget to me. And they're charging $240 per night and doing fine. 74% occupancy rate and a 44,000 annual revenue. A very wide range though. There was a month that was 0. I don't know what happened there. All right, this cheerful 4-bedroom, 3-bath. I think that's a little farther out. I'm not going to include that. Cozy retreat, that's Stillwater. That's also farther out. All right, I don't think these are comparable. Just for funsies, let's look at this lake house that is making $80,000+. Definitely nicer, but the pictures are not that good. I feel like they could do better if they had better pictures. This reads to me as like quirky old St. Paul house that has been somewhat updated. And they are making 22K per year, but they're only available half the year. I don't know if the pricing is done well. $425 of average daily rate, I think, is too high. All right, I think we've got it. Now, after going through a bunch of these within AirDNA, I also like to search on Airbnb to get the full experience as a guest. So I just do the general map area. I do 8 guests and just pick a weekend in November through January and see what comes up. So this first one is a 4-bedroom house and pretty standard looking, nothing crazy. I think you could do better with photos and interior design. And they are charging $194 per night. This second one is a new build. It is prettier for sure. I think it is worth more than what we can charge. And they're charging $261. And now this one is actually kind of cute. I like it. Good photos. $383. Okay. This one is also solid looking, $390 for 2 nights. Now this one has solid pictures, solid design, $327. Not bad. This one is very suburban to me, but well kept, and that's $342. So it seems like some of these first page, nicer, like well-designed houses can charge a good $350, let's say. This Midway Manor, I feel, would be an older style house, and that's $292, but the reviews are not that good. Now, this greenish turquoisey house feels like a flip. I can see that it's a flip. 4-3, and that's only $160. I won't bore you with going through each of these one by one in painstaking detail, but basically, I looked through both AirDNA and on Airbnb directly what the listings look like and what pictures they have, what their calendars are, and see how they have performed historically. And then just because I can't hold on to that many pieces of data at once, I offload everything I find into a document. And on this document, I would keep the revenue data, the occupancy, the average daily rate, the pictures of the place so that I remember which place I'm talking about, and then my notes about all the pluses and minuses in comparison to the subject property, aka the one that my friend has and wants to project revenue for. So for example, this listing makes $50K but has an extra bedroom. This listing makes only $30K but has terrible, terrible pictures that you can definitely do better with. Towards the end of all this research, I also like to punch in the address on property earning potential. Just type in the address of the property you're looking at, and it spits out a revenue projection number based on the number of beds, baths, and guests, as well as an average daily rate and occupancy. Now, I don't rely on this number. This is more of a, I guess, kind of a reassurance and double check after I've already done my homework that I'm not too far off. When there is a discrepancy between this number and my number, I always go with my own number because I know the rationale behind the number that I have. I do like this graph further down where it tells you how this annual revenue estimate had changed over time. So the revenue, as you can see, has like gone up by projection, perhaps based on how much people were making on the platform, but it does look like in the recent months it has tailed off. The last thing I do then is to plug in all these numbers into the short-term rental calculator, which I will link below. I am generally pretty conservative with my estimations, so just looking at kind of the base case with if we just did pretty clean design, nothing frivolous, nothing crazy, but good pictures and, well-maintained and good reviews, obviously catering to groups of like 8+. I'm estimating an average daily rate of $210, which I know is lower, but like I said in a previous video, I like to budget 10% lower just because of a lot of uncertainty in the market. And I am estimating 68% in occupancy rate, and thus the annual revenue would be $52,122. Keep in mind, AirDNA projections already include a cleaning fee, and so there is no further cleaning fee that you should add for your income, but make sure you're factoring that in for your expenses. And then after this, I also like to do a worst case scenario analysis, thinking if we had 8% decline in occupancy and 5% decline in average daily rate, that brings us to a $200 average daily rate and a 60% of occupancy, which means $43,800. Now, it only seems fair to also do a better case scenario, like if we added some amenities, if we had better design, or if the market just does better and my 10% decrease is not warranted, something like that. then we could be charging $235 for an average daily rate, 73% occupancy, resulting in a $62,000 revenue. As you can see, it's kind of a wide range, like in the 40s versus up to the 60s. And so it really depends on your risk tolerance. And as you plug those numbers in, what are your fixed expenses? What would be a minimum that makes you feel comfortable that even if it is the worst case scenario, that you are still happy with this investment. As for what my friend did, ultimately, he also looked at long-term rentals and selling it, which wasn't going as well as they had planned. And they're definitely more familiar with that local area long-term rental market. And they felt, factoring in their time and the potential revenue, it was worthwhile to go ahead and set it up as an Airbnb short-term rental listing. And I'm happy to report that they're doing well so far, and they've already got some good reviews. And I know they work really well together as partners on this venture, and I just wish them all the best. If you are looking to analyze a property or look at short-term rental markets, you can use the link below to check out AirDNA. It is completely free to sign up, and even in the free account, you can get some preliminary data that can give you at least an overall sense of each market that you're looking at. And as you learn more and are getting more serious in purchasing and you want more details on the numbers and historical data, then you can consider purchasing a subscription, whichever one fits your needs. And I hope this video was helpful to you. Please feel free to leave any questions below, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye!